Hi, guys, and welcome to our next lesson. So, this lesson is going to be a little bit different. Today, we're looking at a different aspect of the Enlightenment. We're going to be looking at music as well as a little bit of art and literature during this period, and how it kind of transformed during this period. And what made music and art and literature during this time period different than any other. So, let's get started. So, first, I'm going to talk about, why should we listen to music? Is there a reason we should listen to music? Anything that music does that might benefit us in any way? And we find that it does. So, we found that through studies that preschoolers who study piano, they tend to do approximately 34% better in spatial reasoning. And spatial reasoning is really that part of your brain, part of the memory, the mind that helps you to record information about your environment, about your surroundings. And we also found that listening to music increases levels of something called interleukin, and it's this thing in your body that helps to fight diseases like cancer and other diseases. And we've also found that classical music is more conducive to creative development. You tend to be more creative as you listen to classical music. I also find that it helps me to study better. That's a tip for you. Do with it what you will, but I suggest doing that. Listen to music while you study classical music. And we also found that kids who perform in musical experiences, kids who perform music, they tend to score about 31 points higher on the verbal section of the SAT, and then about 39 points higher on the math section. So really, we find that the brain is actually larger because of music as well. It's helped our brain to develop and become larger. So can an iPhone or an iPad save your life? That's the question. Yes, it can. If you're listening to music on your iPhone or through your iPad, it can, for example, help you to increase the levels of those interleukin and help you to fight cancer and other diseases, right? So keep listening to music. Now, during this time period, in the 1600s and the 1700s, during the Enlightenment, the arts and music evolved to meet the changing tastes of the time. So, just like in earlier periods, artists and composers, they had to, please their patrons. And the patrons were the men and women who commissioned them to make artwork or to make music and basically gave them jobs. So it tended to be the wealthy, right? So, like in the age of King Louis the 14th and during the period of like the 1600s, art and architecture were in the Greek and Roman tradition and in this grand ornate style known as the Baroque. And these Baroque paintings were huge, colorful, and full of excitement, and they really tended to glorify historic battles or the lives of saints, right? So there was a focus on religion, right? And um, basically, during this period, we have a shift towards something called Rococo. But first, remember that Baroque tends to focus more on religion. That's like a key thing to remember from this is that Baroque tends to value and emphasize religion more. So this Rococo style, it tended to become, it was more elegant and charming, and the arts and music tended to become more elegant and charming and in line with this Rococo style. And performances of art and music and theater became more affordable for the middle class during this period. And there was also an outpouring of novels as well. So basically, art, literature, and music became more democratic. More people were more able to access and experience art, music, and literature than ever before. And yeah, this was a tremendous shift. This was an important part of the Enlightenment, was this democratization of the arts and literature. So again, this Rococo style moved away from religion. It was lighter, more elegant, charming. There's more of an emphasis on grace and gentle action, not really as much emphasis on geometric shapes. It wasn't as dynamic, I should say. They used like natural lines of the world, nature, seashells, flowers, graceful curves, designs. And there was this big focus on happiness and love in Rococo paintings. As you can see on this slide here, there is a famous painting called The Happy Accidents of the Swing, and it's by an artist named Jean Honoré Fragonard. And um, you can see in this painting, there's this woman, she's on the swing in that pink dress, very flowery, very elegant. She's swinging back and forth, having a great time. There's some guys, it's kind of hard to see, but in her shadow in the back that are swinging her back and forth. It's very curvy overall. You can see up in the trees, there's some curves here. It's more curvy. There's flowers all over. This is very much in the style, the Rococo style, right? And speaking of novels, as I mentioned earlier, novels became huge during this period. England was really the center of this. The modern novel is really credited to England. So really by the 1700s, by during the Enlightenment, literature developed new forms and was more available to a wider audience, like I said. And really middle class readers, the people who now had access to this, they really liked stories about their own times. And the result of this was an outpouring of novels, and novels are basically long works of fiction. So English novelists ended up writing many popular stories. One of them was, as you can see on the screen, is called Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, and it's by an author named Daniel Defoe. And it's this exciting tale about a sailor who becomes shipwrecked on a tropical island, right? So this is just an example of one of the many novels that came out during this period, that were created during this period. And also, in terms of novels and writing, a lot more women became writers during this period, and there were more women characters as well. And there's this shift, as I mentioned before, there was this emphasis, speaking of art again, there was this, like, the Greek and Roman tradition before. And the reason why during this period as well, we had some, uh, you know, this called neoclassicism during in our architecture. Speaking of architecture, is really because during this period we had a lot more like archaeological finds and discoveries, archaeological digs going on, and so they were finding more artifacts and architecture that had been buried from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So some of these themes in terms of architecture are coming back again, and we're kind of rediscovering the architecture from that period, and it kind of reignited some excitement about Greece and Rome again. And that's exactly what we've learned about in terms of philosophy, right? We've talked about how the Enlightenment, it kind of is like rediscovering the lost knowledge and um, you know beliefs about government and humanity and philosophy from Greece and Rome. We're kind of rediscovering that during this period, but we are also rediscovering some art and architecture, and it's this neoclassicism, as you would call it. So uh, we're going to listen to some music from the Middle Ages, just a short clip. Uh, and this is from 1000 to 1300 AD. And we're going to compare it to a couple other forms of music. And we're going to see like how they compare with one another. That way you can kind of really get an understanding, a feel for what this classical Rococo style of the Enlightenment really is. So we're going to hear this Middle Ages sample right now and kind of compare them.
Ave mundi Maria, Ave Virgis, Ave Pia, Ave plena gratia, Ave Virgo singularis, Veler voluntas signalis, non pars unicem. Ave rosas de cielo
So you can kind of get a feel for this medieval Middle Ages style, right? Now, let's hear a little bit from the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, as we know, was the period that preceded, it came before the Enlightenment. And we're going to hear a little bit of how music kind of evolved from the Middle Ages to this period. So let's take a listen before we go right into the Enlightenment. So you can kind of hear like a flute, right? There's it's lighter definitely compared to the Middle Ages, and it definitely makes you feel like you're in the 1500s, right? Um, so now, before we get to hearing any Enlightenment music, let's talk a little bit about some of the most famous composers. So we're going to hear something from Bach after we talk about him. So Johann Sebastian Bach is a German. He's a German composer, one of the most influential and famous in world history. He was born in 1685, died 1750. So he's alive throughout the Enlightenment, right? And Bach, he is responsible for being one of the greatest composers of Baroque music. And this means, again, remember, Baroque is this emphasis on religion, right? So, church. So, he writes beautiful religious works for organs and choirs. He is a musical titan and a director of church music, and probably the second most influential person in music. So, his last name means brook or stream. That's what Bach means in German. Many of his songs were played at churches, obviously, and he was the chief musician of Germany. Some interesting facts: he was second cousins with his first wife, and he wrote about 1,127 compositions, which is a huge output. His overall output of music that he produced during his lifetime is insane. That's just insane that he was able to produce that much music. And some of these pieces of music were 2 hours long. That's how long these compositions were. Some of them, so that's crazy. And he died in complications during surgery, and he had 7 kids from his first wife and 13 kids from his second wife, for a total of 20 children. So he produced a lot of music and he produced a lot of children, right? Crazy. So we're going to hear a little bit of his music. His music is more complex and innovative than what we just heard, right? So he's bringing in different types of instruments that hadn't really been used before. And that's how you know that we're kind of shifting, right? So we're shifting from this Baroque, like, we're shifting into this Baroque style from this Renaissance music. So it's a little more elegant, a little more classical. We're going to hear from a couple others that are a little lighter and they're a little more characteristic of classical music. Really, Johann Sebastian Bach's really that Baroque period. And it was kind of played for royal courts and opera houses, and really before this time, like I said, only the social elite could afford to hear this type of music. But then in the early to mid 1700s, when Bach was around, the growing middle class could afford to pay for concerts to be performed publicly. So he became one of the most towering influential musical figures of this era. um, and he uses, you're going to hear a lot more organ and choir music, like I said. And he also used violin and harpsichord, but that's not really what we're going to hear today. So let's take a listen. So as you can kind of hear, definitely this sounds like it would belong in a church, right? That's definitely a Baroque style. This is definitely Baroque style of music, right? And you can hear that organ, and you can just imagine probably a choir could sing along to that type of music, right? So definitely that's stereotypical of this Baroque style. Now, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was born 1756, died at 1791 at a very young age, right? So Mozart was Austrian, right? And he is probably the most popular, most famous musician, composer of all time in all of human history. So he composed about 600 different works and was a prolific classical composer. So classical is a little bit different than Baroque. Classical is more elegant and lighter, and kind of just like that Rococo style of art. It's like that version of music, right? That Rococo style. It's kind of what it is in terms of music. Is this classical music, and uh, he was a child prodigy. He wrote his first song at the age of 2, and his first opera was at the age of 11. He gave his first concert really at the age of 6. He was born in Germany, right? Died at the age of 35, so he died young. He composed 30 symphonies between the age of 8 and 17. And when he died, he was bankrupt. So his entire, like, his issue throughout his life was he couldn't find a steady patron. And remember, a patron is the men and women, the wealthy men and women who would pay for these composers and artists to create things for them. They would commission them to create works and give them jobs. But he couldn't really find somebody who was willing to do that consistently. So he wandered around trying to find people to pay him. He was kind of really bad with his money to begin with, and he had a lot of financial problems. So he died. When he died, he was bankrupt, and he had an unmarked grave because in order to have a marked grave, to have a tombstone, you had to pay for that, and he didn't have the money for that. He was in tremendous debt when he died. He'd become homeless at one point, but still, despite all that, he was influential, tremendously influential in opera, especially. And many people mimicked him after and tried to copy his style and his works. He was a larger than life figure, so a lot of people try to mimic him. And it's unfortunate he died so young. He could have produced probably a lot more. I mean, 600 works is still an incredible amount, but had he been able to live another 30 years, I wonder like how much more he could have produced. Is unfortunate that he died so early. So let's listen to a little bit of his style. Remember, this is more classical. It's not as Baroque, right? So it's going to be lighter, even lighter, and more elegant. So you can really hear in this classical style, you can hear the violin, right? You can hear the singers are definitely a higher key, they're at a higher octave. And you can also hear horns as well in his music. And overall, it just gives it a lighter kind of feeling, more elegant. style compared to the Baroque and previous eras. Especially now, think back to the medieval Middle Age one. Compare it to this, and it's like night and day. They're totally different, right? Now we're going to talk this composer Ludwig van Beethoven lived from 1770 to 1827. So really, he was at the tail end of the Enlightenment, or if the twilight of the Enlightenment, right? So he he was at the towards the end, and he was a German composer, one of the most influential, and he really was a transition from classical to romantic music. So again, classical is like characteristic of the Enlightenment, and because he was towards the end, he's seen as a transition between the classical era from the Enlightenment to more romantic music of the later period, and really the romantic music kind of took off during from like 1830 or so, and it was a lot more expressive and emotional, and we'll hear that in his music. He's a little more emotional than Mozart. So he actually dedicated a fun fact. He dedicated his third symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte. So he's alive during the time of Napoleon, during the time of the French Revolution. So there was a lot of hope that democracy would spread as a result of this revolution, as well as the American Revolution. We've been talking about the development of democracy throughout this entire class and the Enlightenment's influence on democracy. And so Napoleon, we're going to learn about in our unit on the French Revolution. But von Beethoven, he thought that Napoleon would help to bring democracy to France and the Enlightenment to all of Europe. And uh, we'll see how that goes in our upcoming unit. What happens there? There's a debate over that. But so about Beethoven, some personal details. He never married anybody, but he did have a secret lover. He wrote 9 symphonies. All of them are performed still to this day. He actually was deaf. He became deaf. He wasn't born deaf, but he became deaf in his 20s. And, you might be thinking, like, how did he perform music if he became deaf? Well, he was able to hear a little bit for a while. He became completely deaf at the age of 40, but before that, he could kind of hear a little. But uh, despite that, he would listen to quote unquote listen to the vibrations of the piano. So he saw off the legs of the piano so that he could feel the vibrations as he played. So that's how he was able to perform. And obviously, he was very passionate about music. He was obviously he's a composer. He really loved music a lot, and losing your hearing, it was devastating for him, and he contemplated committing suicide because of that. He ultimately didn't go through with it, but he was suicidal at some point. Um, he's known for getting his inspiration in the woods. He would go to the woods to find some inspiration for his work, for his music. And Mozart, the guy we just talked about earlier, he claimed that one day the entire world would be talking about Ludwig van Beethoven. So he knew of him even. Um, and it kind of just goes to show how influential he was. And in order for someone like Mozart to have known of him when he was so young. So we're going to hear a little bit of his Moonlight Sonata, again, one of his most famous pieces. Okay, so that's a little bit of Beethoven, right? So let's recap the three different types of music, right? So you have like Baroque, right, which was from 1600s to 1750. Really think of Bach when you hear the word Baroque, think of Bach, right? B. This emphasis on religion. Remember, Bach was a director of church music, um, and it's very huge, and there's excitement to it. Remember the organ and choirs, that's kind of that Baroque feeling and style of music. Then you have classical, which is more Mozart and Beethoven. Beethoven's a little kind of a transition period, but especially Mozart is a classical, um, and there's a lot of elegance and balance and unity, and it's lighter. You can hear the harpsichord, which was this kind of similar to a piano, but it's like part of this new rococo, elegant, graceful style that was used. So think of that kind of music, that style of music, and associate that with classical music from 1750 to 1820. And then you have romantic, which you can kind of hear a little bit of Beethoven. He's in that transition period. It's more expressive and dramatic and individualistic, and it's also influenced a little bit by nationalism. So think of that expressive, emotional, romantic music. And those are really the three different types of music. And the one that's most characteristic, especially of the Enlightenment, is classical for sure. So that's it for today's lesson. Let me know if you do have any questions, need any help on the assignment. Make sure to email me, reach out during class, and good luck on the assignment.